The next speaker that we have is Miss Mariea Postol. Mary is the founder and president, as well as the chief executive officer of the Fair Hiring Initiative. The initiative is a social enterprise that develops, tests, and promotes ethical recruitment, models, and addresses issues of forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking in labor migration. In 2004, Mary founded Verite Southeast Asia and served as its executive director until 2012, where she led the development of Verite Systems approach for social responsibility, the Verite Fair Hiring Toolkit, and prepared the original draft for the Manpower Verite Ethical Framework for cross-border recruitment. She has trained and consulted for companies such as Starbucks, Apple, the Home Depot, Walmart, Gap, Levi Strauss, Hewlett-Packard, New Balance, Hershey's, and Motorola. And this is not an advertisement call, yeah, for the companies. In the improvement of internal and supply chain level program systems and organizational competencies for managing corporate social responsibility. Prior to her work with Verite, Mary served as an independent consultant on poverty alleviation and social reform and worked on projects for the Philippine government, bilateral agencies, international NGOs, and a number of UN agencies. Mary, over to you. Mary, are you there?
I'm here. Hi,
Yeah.
Dato.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right.
And thank you, MFA, for this opportunity to speak. I got the invitation about 24 hours ago, but as usual, I can't say no to William. So I will apologize in advance that I'm not as prepared as I normally would be, but I'll do my best to address the questions that were requested. Now, let me just give you some background on what we do. The Fair Hiring Initiative is focused primarily on ethical recruitment models and ensuring that workers, migrant workers, are recruited in a fair, legal, and humane manner. We've been working on labor certification models that improve the performance of recruitment agencies in both sending and receiving countries to prevent issues of trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and a lot of the employment issues or employment contract violations that have been talked about by the speakers before me. I would also like to mention, because I think it's more pertinent to the discussion right now, that I'm the founder of Verite Southeast Asia, which works on corporate social responsibility in supply chains. And I resumed my position as executive director in January. So I think it's more pertinent possibly to speak about the activities of Verite Southeast Asia in this forum, as it speaks more directly to the appeal that the consortium is putting forward. What we're seeing, so Verite works on, as I said, supply chain social responsibility. It uses, it leverages the power of the buyer to make the buyer or the brand to make positive improvements in the workforces of its supply chain. So what Verite does basically is it conducts one of the pivotal or central functions of Verite over the last 20 years has really been creating some transparency to the work to Southeast Asian, South Asian, and African workplaces where Western products are being manufactured. And what we try to do is we assess companies against the standards that are set by either a company or an industry group, and through that identify where the gaps in performance are in terms of meeting voluntary standards. As Golda mentioned, these standards should and have tended to be higher than country laws, because mainly for an international brand, they have to meet the laws in every country, not just one. So they set the standards at a much higher, typically at a level where anywhere in the world they would be meeting at the bare minimum country law. And a lot of these standards are meant to prevent issues like wage theft, issues like debt bondage, child labor, and other issues, particularly forced labor related to migrant workers. What we're seeing in a lot, I must premise this also with the fact that Verite has been working with Fortune 500 brands and who tend to adhere to international standards. And what I'm talking about here is more about the issues in formal employment rather than informal employment. What we're seeing is really an exacerbation by COVID of the already harmful and risky practices that we've been seeing previously. In a recent, we were recently approached by a client, and maybe I can just talk about that. We were recently approached by a client to look into the issues of stranded, to look into the conditions of stranded and returned Indonesian and Nepali workers, to make sure they were looking at it, to make sure that they were meeting their own code of conduct standards, but also they were responding to an inquiry by a non-government organization that came from complaints made by workers. So it was the brand or the company that owned the factory that was approached by an NGO speaking on behalf of workers who were complaining about subsistence allowances provided by the company and other issues. What was interesting about this is that this led to the company requesting Verite to interview these workers and understand exactly what the situation was. Now, they owned the company, they had staff within that company, but they wanted to have a third-party review to make sure that, because they said they are in uncharted waters and the issues of COVID have not been really integrated into their code of conduct, and they would like to understand better what they could improve. so what we saw were really the issues that we were finding were some of the workers had typically the repatriation period is about 2 weeks, during which time 2 weeks to 3 weeks, during which time workers are repatriated to their home countries after the end of their contract. In this case, because of COVID, workers had to stay for the repatriation was delayed because of lack of flights, among other things, and the delays in getting the proper documentation out of the destination country authorities. And workers were stranded for as long as, some workers were stranded for as long as 100 days. And typically, the company doesn't normally have to pay for meals and continuing accommodations for workers for such a long period. So this is something that they had to add on to their what they provided to workers. So supplemental subsistence allowances during the period that they were there. Apparently, they were the government, the sending country government embassy, also provided some help. They had to provide increased communication facilities and increase in communication channels, I'm sorry, because of the constant need to communicate with the workers. What we found was that they really needed to change to reinforce their standards with the COVID situation in mind, because for example, the cost increases, the time spent by staff, the workers, the issues of workers related to, you know, mental health concerns, not being able to leave their dormitories, not having enough money for all of their needs during that period. And I think some of the other issues had to do more with delays in answers to their questions on when they could depart, etc. So those, I think, in this situation, it was really just reviewing what a company needed to address more clearly and integrate into their code of conduct or into their standards and in their procedures, to make sure that they were meeting the needs of the workers even after they had ended their contracts. So in this case, it was fortunate that there were no wage theft issues, but there were delays in payment of last wages, and the last wages of workers were actually had to be spent on their own subsistence during the 100 days that they were stranded. So those are just some of the issues that we saw in this situation. Some of the things that Verite has been doing to address, to assist, and that might help to promote the appeal is we try and strengthen the codes of conduct of companies, help them review their codes of conduct, and identify where COVID-19 impacts could weaken their procedures. For example, speeding up repatriation making sure that workers are paid their last wages before they leave, ensuring free food and accommodations, medical care and insurance, just the provision of some confidence that if a worker gets sick of COVID, they have someone to turn to, they know where to go, the company will cover those costs. We've also advised companies to identify hotspots and anticipate issues, particularly in sectors where there are, for example, production booms. That could increase hours, force workers to pay to work hours that they might not be paid for, and mainly involuntary overtime, etc. We also encourage companies to set up, if they don't have them already, effective monitoring and grievance mechanisms. In the example that I gave of the facility, they had 5 grievance channels for workers, well established, but still the workers felt that the responses were delayed. They felt that the responses were delayed, were inconsistent, and were not satisfactory, and it increased the workers' discomfort and a feeling of uncertainty. So clarity, consistency, and promptness in responding to workers' grievances and questions during the COVID period. How to promote the appeal. And I think some of the two speakers who spoke before me already started talking about some of these things. I think one is really to engage and secure commitments from industry groups that are already supporting responsible recruitment and migrant worker rights to adopt the appeal or to help push the appeal, or to integrate the components of the appeal into their existing voluntary codes. We can also make sure that investors, when I speak of industry groups, I mean those groups that already have strong standards that support migrant workers, such as the Responsible Business Alliance, the Seafood Task Force in Thailand, the leadership group that I'm sure Neil will be talking about in a little while. I think companies also listen to investors, and shareholder resolutions, or engaging with investor groups that fund, the construction companies that Isabel talked about, and making sure that the components of the appeal are included in the way the investors screen their investments, and the companies that they will invest in might be helpful. I think it's important to influence and leverage the public commitments that companies have made in support of migrant workers and their rights. And then, of course, a lot of companies, worker voice, worker feedback, grievance mechanisms, these are very popular now among corporates. Everybody is setting up a grievance mechanism. I think civil society needs to test those grievance mechanisms more. Test them and see how effective, how responsive these grievance mechanisms are for issues that we are looking at in terms of of wage theft. I understand that Isabel and Golda have used them and have engaged directly with the companies that and have gotten some responses. I think we are going to be looking at what we've also been talking to a lot of recruitment agencies, and we know that recruitment in a lot of sending countries has stopped. And what's happening now is really people just in coming home in masses. But what recruitment agencies have told us is that we are looking at an increase in recruitment costs of about 40%. Now, we were talking to an agency that's, that earns its revenues only from employers and does not charge anything to workers. And they're saying the cost to an employer per worker will increase by 40%. What this means to us who are working on recruitment reform and migrant worker rights is that, you know, we only have maybe 2% of the whole industry, maybe less than 2% of the whole recruitment industry actually following an employer pays model. So when we talk about a 40% increase in recruitment costs, and that will be due to quarantine requirements, higher airfare costs, longer time while workers wait to go out, higher documentation costs, as well as even things like PPE. That's what would cause this increase. We're actually looking at for maybe more than a 40% increase in what workers are likely to bear. The fact that there's increasing unemployment, returned migrants will be competing with local workers for jobs, as well as with other migrants for jobs abroad. And all of the restrictions on travel, these will all cause increased desperation and workers wanting to leave and find jobs at any cost. Their vulnerability to exploitation increases 100-fold. And the cost that they are going to bear, which will also increase their vulnerability later to wage theft, to forced labor, to other forms of exploitation, will increase accordingly. So I think that's what we're looking at. And I think for us, it's really how do we prevent, what are the preventive mechanisms? How do we strengthen that? And then what are the controls for mitigation, such as the transitional justice that we're promoting through this MFA initiative. I'll end with that, and I hope I haven't gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for enlightening us on the power of the buyer to make positive changes. I would also like to thank you for your insights on how engagement with business leads to positive change, that it is imperative that we engage. And what is gratifying to note at this session is that you have also informed us that you will be incorporating the third appeal on how businesses should act responsibly in ensuring justice for migrant workers. So this is something that I hope that the various businesses will take on. We will come back to you in the question and answer session after this.